are getting into the debauchery on today's show. Okay, we're speaking about that article penned by Miss Sisulu, the article that launched 1,000 pins and 1,000 responses. She speaks about the rule of law. I've got some takes on that and responses and all that delicious stuff. And then we've got a spiritual reset in free stuff towards the end of the show. I'm excited. I'm quite excited for this one. Let's get into it. Welcome. If you've never seen me or heard my voice before, hi, I'm Lele. You'll find me at Lele Motari underscore on Twitter and Instagram if you may be looking for me there. Otherwise, you can just engage with me in the comments, really, because I keep my eye on those as well. So I don't know. It's up to you. Thank you so much for joining me. If you haven't seen or heard the previous episode, I got into modesty and I spoke about conviction, and we had a fun time just digging into what the standard for modesty is. And yeah, I don't know. It gets, yeah. Go check that out. I would recommend it. But today we're speaking about, if you've been keeping your eye on the news at all, or on the, I guess, social media streets, you've seen something about this article penned by Umamulindiwe Sisulu, Melindiwe. Whoo! She came into 2022 guns blazing. I believe the article was published on the 7th of January. And it's really the article that launched 1,000 pens because, whoa, since then, the radicals and the liberals of the ANC have just been mudslinging, right? Will the real progressives please stand up? And it's been an interesting debate. It gets us talking about the rule of law under colonial rule. So that would be slavery in America and apartheid in South Africa. And Mamulindiwe actually tries to make that, draw that parallel. I believe it's in her initial article. She tries to draw that parallel to America. And yeah, so, and then it also gets us speaking about the rule of law in the post-democratic in the democratic post-colony, pardon me. And this idea of the rule of law needing to work for Africans in Africa if it is to be legitimate, right? There are questions posed about, well, whose law is it anyway, you know, and ideas like that. So we get into, we get into some very interesting stuff. And pardon me, Ubuntu as well being invoked in law, and is that not a way in which you know we're incorporating indigenous African laws, right, and practices in our legal system? So what does transformation look like? What has it been looking like, right, in the democratic dispensation, right? And there seems to be a sense in which Umamulindiwe is saying that the rule of law is standing in the way of transformation, right? This is very clear from her article. People have described that initial article as incoherent. I wouldn't go that far. Um, I think it's coherent, but it's a rant, right? Like you can hear that this, like there are no examples, right? And Minister Lamola points this out in his response that he writes, because he comes through with a whole bag of case law, right? Because there is that much available, right? South African case law, contemporary case law, is actually quite left leaning. And if you're someone who reads South African case law, you know that. Like, you also would have been taken aback a little bit by what Lindiwe Sisulu was saying, because it makes you wonder then what more, you know, under separation of powers, you know, what more really can be done by the judiciary, you know. But how is the rule of law standing in the way of transformation? She doesn't seem to give us examples. She depicts these dark scenes. I mean, it's really riveting stuff. You should read that one, particularly the initial one. She writes a response as well, but the initial one I mean, that's the one, right? That set everything on fire. So, but there are no examples, and Minister Lamola's response illustrates this so well, right? Um, there's so much um, of South Africa's case law is left leaning, and so because there's this idea of transformative constitutionalism, right? And as particularly the higher you go, right, the Concord, I mean, Concord judgments are beautiful, right? They're poetry, really. But anyway, it's very left leaning, all right. And the minister cites this. Minister Lamola cites this. I mean, Melindy is also a minister of tourism, so I must be clear on that. Minister Lamola cites this, but there's so much of it, and he gives so many examples that there's even a growing voice or at least a growing number of conservative voices in South African legal culture. There's actually a prominent professor, I believe, at the University of Pretoria, a law professor at the University of Pretoria, who also wrote a book on this recently, and he's one of the voices as well. And then you've got the liberals, right, who would fall under that transformative constitutionalist camps. Those are your peer forces, right, at UCT. And the issue with with transformative constitutionalism, and I believe I've not just written about this but spoken about this as well on the podcast, is that it risks or presents the counter-majoritarian dilemma, right? And which means that it threatens the separation of powers. Um, it it undermines the role of the legislature, because it essentially allows judges to legislate from the bench. And so, what does it mean to elect representatives to the legislature to begin with? You know what I mean? But also the point is, law is fundamentally constrained, right? There's a sense in which it seems that there's an expectation from the side, from these people who say that the rule of law. I mean, okay, let's start here, right? Before we go too far, and I might be risking just the order of my thoughts here, and how I was intending to order my ideas, but let's start with the understanding that the rule of law refers to a scenario, right? In which everyone is equal under the law. So when you say you take issue, so it's not so much a rule, right, in terms of a law, it's more of a legal principle, right? The principle of legality. Everyone is equal under the law. So when you say you take issue with the rule of law, I don't know. You see, this is why examples would have been helpful. You understand? Because so the same camp is the camp that cites apartheid and Nazi Germany as examples of the rule of law having been used to oppress and things like that. Okay, so yeah, that I think that's very hollow, because those are very clear perversions of the rule of law. So I think that's a dishonest submission to make, particularly in the case of apartheid, because that was under parliamentary sovereignty. And you would recall that in South Africa currently, the constitution enjoys sovereignty. So, there's a huge conflation of the circumstances and of the reality currently. But also, the point is the law is fundamentally constrained, right? Um, and this, you see this a lot in the law, right? So the and it has to be constrained to something. Like, there's no way, no one can just come and update the law and just make it whatever, right? The experience, that's why precedent is such a huge thing in the law, right? But there are also other ways that the law has constraints and represents these constraints that I'm talking about. And I'll illustrate that later on, for instance. But it's essentially to do with the inner morality of law, right? And I think Minister Sisulu goes into this in her piece. I think this is now the response piece, she labels it under another set of principles by another guy. But it's Fuller's inner morality of law, the way that I studied it in law school. But so yeah, there are a lot of constraints in law, right? And this brings to mind a quote by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice, who said that the life of the law has not been logic, it's been experience. Um, so the whole point of equality under the law is a constraint of law, right? It's a way that law is constraining itself. So we've got precedent, we've got equality under the law. And that's the rule of law. That's how it is, right? It's as simple as that. It's not some power card that judges try to play, when they try to shut down arguments. That's all it means, which is why examples would have been nice, because I can't help but, like, I'm left to imagine what is meant. And the only examples that they're able to cite, we don't get actual judgments, but it's really just examples about land, um, and land restitution, and things like that, and poverty and economic redistribution. And it's very vague, but also it speaks to that point that I was making earlier about the counter-majoritarian dilemma. Are those really issues that judges can really solve from the bench? You know, um, should those not be issues of the legislative body? You know, because those sound like issues for the legislative body. You know, yeah. So just think about that. That's too much power to give to judges. Don't enjoy that much power, right? For them to just be able to decide these things ad hoc. Um, that it doesn't work that way under separation of powers. So what do I think is happening here? Because there's a lot, and I don't want to go into the individual pieces that were written, but essentially I've used what I read, to make my own deductions. So what do I think is happening? I think, well, this is Minister Sisulu being honest, right? She says, listen, just give us a little bit more power, right? And we've explored this idea on the podcast before. She says, just give us a little bit more power. She says, things are so bad, not because they have to be, really. They're bad because of the failure of other people to be as wise and as noble as we would be in their positions. So it's just the failure of these judges, of this judiciary, to be as wise and as noble as they should be, and as we can be. So that's what's happening here. Particularly when you remember that, or at least when you try to reconcile with the idea of getting rid of the rule of law, what exactly would we put in its place? And that goes back to my explanation, that foundation I said earlier on, about the rule of law really just like being very unproblematic. Um, what would we put in its place? Which rules would apply to who, where, when? You know, it makes things it makes things very awkward legally. But also this idea, you see, it misses. I feel like this the trajectory of this whole conversation also just robs us of a rich conversation, because I would like to know. I would like to hear examples of these indigenous African legal traditions, if they exist, which can be incorporated in our legal system. Let's definitely do that, right? Because that's what Minister Lamola is saying as well. He's saying, well, we invoke Ubuntu in our judgments. We've set that down in precedent. That's a big thing, and he's not wrong, right? But so if there are all these other things that we're missing out on, that we're dismissing, that we're ignoring, okay, let's hear them. Where are they? Let's put them in. Where are they? So it's a bit jarring to for that vacuum to just stand gaping, particularly because there are also examples about how the rule of law interacting with African legal traditions, right? Like primogeniture, right, and the right to inherit, but also the right to, pardon, inherit thrones, right, in the case of female heirs and things like that. And there are many instances in which um, the African customary law, had to be measured up to the Constitution, just like everything else, right? Because that's how it works under constitutional sovereignty. And where it's been found wanting, and this is not just customary law, Roman Dutch law as well, everything else, common law, all sorts of things need to be held in to the standard of the Constitution, right? And where it's found wanting, it's been brought to line, right? So, um, primogeniture is just one example, right? That was a long-standing African legal practice until Bear changed that, right? The Bear judgment changed that, and I don't know. It's the silence on that point. Um, I think is a bit dishonest, because surely this features in the conversation about the rule of law working for Africans in Africa, because practices like primogeniture, like uktwala, uklola, are those anachronisms in a post-colonial democracy? Would you say that those are valid? Would you say that those are appropriate? Those are fitting? Would you say they aren't? Why would you say so? Um, and the way of the courts has been that they are brought in line with constitutional values, right? Of equality, of dignity, of non-sexism, and the like. Um, this has had the effect of liberating women, empowering children, and all of that. That is an effect of the rule of law. Do we take issue with those things as well? Are those constitutional changes to the indigenous African way of doing things, are they valid? How come? You know, Perhaps it's because these changes would be considered something that is working for Africans in Africa. Um, Maybe. So, really, then it would be a case by case assessment um, about which laws, apply and really to where, which then wouldn't be the rule of law. So, I guess then it makes sense. But um, I would be very worried. I would be very worried to follow someone who was advocating for scrapping the rule of law. I really would. The rule of law is a very important constraint on people generally. And I guess this speaks about your vision, right? Your philosophy of life, how you see people. But it also brings up a conversation about who sets up the economy, because there's also, as I said earlier on, an economic perspective about economic redistribution as well. So not just the land, right? But economic redistribution. And there's a conversation about who sets up the economy. What exactly would the judge's role, the judiciary's role be, in that? And the point here is the market sets up the economy, right? So there's no such thing as defining Uh, it's this implication that you can define the public interest on your own, where without leaving it to the individuals themselves, to just, you know, accommodate and compete and interact with other people in the market. So yeah, I think it would have been nice to get a better idea of what is meant by indigenous African well, at least what is meant by the rule of law working for Africans in Africa. Um, you know, what does it mean in terms of land redistribution? Does that mean like, what does it mean? The rule of law in terms of land redistribution. So, should it not apply in land redistribution? Should Africans be favored instead in terms of land redistribution? So, the rule of law should be waived as it relates to land redistribution. Like, I don't know. I feel like I'm missing that because what seems to be the case is that they're just not interested in the rule of law, right, to one extent or the other, right? So whether it means only in the area of land redistribution and economic redistribution and things like that, but also maybe altogether, you know, and both are very worrisome. So that's something to think about. But also, I've been meditating on this idea of equality of outcomes and equity really being evil. Um, and I know I kind of came left field with that one. But yeah, it's something about it is very, it's, it goes against God, you know? The idea that you can dictate outcomes, the idea that you can make outcomes equals, the mere presumption that outcomes should be equal, you know, the temerity of it all, to presume that outcomes should be equal and you will decide which outcomes will be equal and how. And, there's just a lot of, there's a lot of hubris in it, there's a lot of pride in it. It's very, very evil. And I think also on the flip side of that, I'm also just coming to terms with how much of Christianity conforms with the constrained vision. So this is the idea of the fallenness of man, the fallen nature, the fallen character, pardon me, of human nature, of the human condition, man being inherently fallible, and there not being any kind of political messiah who's going to come through and just decide things and be able to and not be corrupted by power, and not fall short. It's just not going to happen. So it's better to have constraints in power. It's better to erect institutions that hem people in, that keep people in check, where one group is offset by the other group, where no one can just run amok. That's just simpler, right? Because that makes more sense, and also that's what experience has taught us. Let me know what your thoughts are, not just on the rule of law, but on the issue of human nature needing constraints, and how much power do you think we can actually handle, particularly in these kinds of positions, in the judiciary, even in the legislature. These politicians, how much power can they actually handle, particularly when we consider that they keep asking for more and more? In the comments, or at Lele Mutani underscore on Twitter and on Instagram. Free stuff, let's go. I'm getting into a spiritual reset in free stuff, so that's where we are. I'm looking for ways to, and I've been looking for ways, right, to build spiritual disciplines, to fortify spiritual disciplines. So for by spiritual disciplines, I mean things like praying, like fasting, things like worshiping, reading, studying the word, things like that. Even fellowship, I would consider something that's a spiritual discipline, especially for me, someone who prefers to just be on their own, Um, I'm called to fellowship, and so I should take that seriously. So it's been a time for me of just going back to basics, of going back to the lost instructions, so to speak, and going back to that place of just obeying, in terms of, those spiritual disciplines. And I thought I should just come and give you a few points that I'm employing, that I'm applying uh, in in my life, right, to this end. Uh, First of all, intention. Decide. Be deliberate about changes that you're going to make, right? Um, Significant changes. So this is what you want to do. It's important to me because of this. Write it down. All right. This is something that I do. Plan for it. For me, visualization also works. So try to imagine the changes that you want to make. Right. Praying more. Being able to fast for longer, or fast more diligently, right? Being able to worship for longer, being able to just meditate on the word for longer. Second of all, routine really helps, right? If you're looking to make changes, particularly if you're willing to make something like more than one change in your life, if you're looking to change a few things, things that consume time out of your day. A routine is a good way to try to, organize those blocks, so to speak, of time. And for me, I find that mornings are the best, right? So carve out time, take inventory of how you spend your time. What I do usually when I find that, oh my goodness, I don't even know how to organize everything that I need to do, is I take a day to not have a to-do list, but I try to be as productive as I can during that day. So I try to see how I flow from one task to the other, um, just naturally, right? So the things I feel like doing at which time of day, usually I like to read and write, and like during the afternoons, around sunset, things like that. It just comes naturally. Something about me just wants to read during that time of day, or just wants to write during that time of day. You know what I mean? And then things like cooking, things like planning, things like drawing, things like cleaning. At which times of day do you just want to do it? Some people never want to do anything ever, but there are things. It just helps you. To plan your day so that you're not forcing yourself to do everything at every time. There are things that you just find it easier to do at certain times of the day. So use that to your advantage, right? And yeah, and there are things that you might enjoy doing at certain times of the day versus other times. So yeah, and also it'll give you an understanding of how long it takes you to do certain things as well, right? So on that day where you just try to be as productive as you can, but don't hold yourself to any to-do list or schedule or something. It'll give you an idea of how long it takes you to get ready, how long it takes you to write a piece, how long it takes you to clean your flat, how long it takes you, so that'll also help you to carve out the time and to schedule things accordingly. And also three aids, right? Use aids, use things to reward yourself, use things to motivate yourself, use cues to remind yourself to do things, right? Things like putting something next to something else to remind your brain that, oh, I need to take that pill while I, draft this, or while I fill in my diary, or while I open this, and, something like that. So pairing is a good way to use cues. Use diaries, use apps, use alarms, use treats, anything to facilitate the overall action that you're looking to take, right? So do that with yourself, and be selfish, right? Be selfish about what you enjoy, what will help you get the best out of yourself, but don't be self-sabotaging, right? If you know that you can go overboard with something, don't tempt yourself, right? So this is about getting the best out of yourself. You're manipulating the situation, your life, your context, to get the best out of yourself, right? So you're not trying to self sabotage. So don't go wild with the rewards or anything like that. Um, but be it treat it like you're preparing for a child, right? So you wouldn't put unhealthy treats for a child, but you'd want them to enjoy the treats that you do give them, right? So that they motivate them to do well again next time, right? So for me, I find that something like setting things up to be done is a good way for me to treat myself like a child in motivating myself to do things that I wouldn't like otherwise want to do. So something like just putting all my bath things ready for me to bath, something like that, is a way for me to mother myself and get myself to do things that usually I'd be like, oh, what a schlep, oh my goodness, something like that. So set up your workstation, make it nice for yourself to find, all prepared, for yourself, for your future self. Your future self will always appreciate it, trust me. And also eliminate distractions. You need to be disciplined about eliminating distractions. Again, this goes to treating it like your inner child, right? Your inner child needs to know that no, it's time to work. Number four, surrender. For me, this is important because I find myself resisting obedience sometimes, or resisting God's grace, really, to help me obey. Because I find that it's easy. There's so much resistance that comes in disobedience. You know, um, there's so much resistance and it's unnecessary. So what I mean here is surrender to obedience. It's so much more. Do you know the peace that comes with just doing something right? Doing what you had to do. There's just a peace that comes with it. So don't resist, right? So surrender, and give up any attachment to outcomes. I think first, so you can't do it on your own. Give up any attachment to being able to go the first week and go. You see, don't be crazy about expectations from yourself, right? So don't attach yourself to outcomes, which is part of surrendering. You need to give up the fact that it's up to you. It's not up to you, it's up to God, right? Whether or not this thing works out, your new routine works out, and you stick to your New Year's resolutions and all of that, that's up to God. You need to surrender to God, right? Don't try to trust in your own strength. You can't do it on your own. You will fall short, right? And besides, God's grace is sufficient, so you don't need to, right, come up to any perfect standard. All you need to do is keep trying. And this is important to me. I learned this last year, is to first be consistent in trying to be consistent. If you're trying to build that muscle, I think you can be too, particularly if you're me and you're someone who's a recovering perfectionist. You can be very difficult on yourself with some things, and you want to get it right and it needs to be perfect all the time. Don't do that to yourself. First, be consistent in trying, in at least trying, right? So first, be consistent in making an attempt. Always make an attempt, essentially, is what I'm saying. Always make an attempt. So even when you aren't consistent in going to the gym, you aren't consistent in writing every day, you aren't consistent in doing whatever every day and going out to do whatever every weekend, at least be consistent in trying again. So don't do this thing of leaving it till next week Monday. I'll try again next week Monday. No, try tomorrow already. Try now, in fact. Already now, I'm back on the diet. You know what I mean? Be consistent about trying. At least start there, right? You're not going to be consistent like off the bat with whatever you're trying to do with your new whatever that you're trying to implement, your new habits that you're trying to implement. But at least be consistent about trying. And I think for me that has worked for me in quite a few areas. Um, so don't be too fatalistic, right? If you get something wrong one time, try again literally as soon as possible, because it's not all lost. All is not lost. The week is not lost. The day is not lost. Why? Who says who? You know what I mean? So don't do that to yourself. Um, don't try to never get it wrong. Just try to get it right more often than you get it wrong. You know what I mean? So that's a more bearable standard for me. Work on just the overall percentage of how many times you try versus how many times you don't try. You're just trying to try more times than you don't. That's, to me, makes sense. The 2-minute hack works in this sense. If you don't know the 2-minute hack or the 2 minute rule, it says just do the first 2 minutes of a task, um, and then you can leave it, right? So literally, after 2 minutes, you can leave it, and that's a good way to get yourself to do something. You're doing it. You're doing it just for 2 minutes. If after 2 minutes I don't feel it, I'm done. I did it for 2 minutes. You know what I mean? And if after 2 minutes, which usually is the case, after 2 minutes you're like, let me just finish the paragraph. You know what I mean? And then you've written a paragraph, which is great. So the 2 minute hack, use that. And lastly, I would say rejoice, right? And this is something that I need to learn to do with the little things as well, particularly in this area of my life, to just rejoice and remember that progress is better than perfection. This is something from free stuff a few episodes ago, and just remaining in that awareness, to let go of any attachment to outcomes and to enjoy the journey, and the learning, and just to be patient with the progress, and the process, that I'm in, and the journey that I'm taking, and just let God guide me. I think that, it's something. I think I've got a piece of hair. I'm so sorry. This has been bothering me. I'm so sorry. But I think that for me, oh, I'm just in a very strange time, with letting God, um, lead me, because I'm having to give up, layers of myself I didn't even know I had to give. So yeah, it's it's being vulnerable, and it's feeling exposed, and feeling, just helpless some of the time as well. But I think I'll leave it there for today. Let's continue in the comments. Let's continue the conversation in the comments section, or find me at Lele Mutari underscore on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to have to ask you to breathe deeply, drink water, and to pray. Please, it's been an absolute pleasure spending time with you. I've been Lele Mutari. Stay blessed. Ah.